A mountain man was forced to marry an obese 18-year-old, but what she did next left him in tears. The church bell tolls in a dusty frontier town. A lone mountain man stands at the altar, jaw tight, while whispers ripple through the crowd. She steps forward, mocked, humiliated, unwanted, but lifts her chin with quiet dignity. The vows are spoken. The gavel falls. Their fate is sealed. Back in the mountains, he expects dead weight. But she surprises him, chopping wood, cooking stews, stitching his torn coat, each act stronger than the last. And just when his heart begins to soften, a dark truth rises. She was traded like property to cover her father's gambling debts. Worse, the railroad men are coming for his land. As fire consumes their cabin and jail bars slam shut, she refuses to bow. She rides through snow and storm, carrying secrets that could bring down powerful men. The toughest man in the high country will soon discover the greatest strength on the frontier wasn't his own. But can love and faith truly conquer betrayal, greed, and the weight of shame? Or will this unlikely marriage collapse under the pressures of the West? Your comments remind me that we're not alone in feeling deeply. If loyalty, second chances, and human dignity mean something to you, then you're right where you belong. The morning sun had barely crept over the eastern mountains when William Hale heard the sharp rap of knuckles on his cabin door. The sound echoed through the quiet line shack like a gunshot, startling him from his solitary breakfast of corn mush and coffee. Sheriff Riker stood on the worn wooden porch, his badge catching the early light. "William Hale, your presence is required in town. Judge's orders." William's jaw tightened. Nothing good ever came from such summons. "What's this about, Sheriff?" "Just come along peaceful-like," Riker said, shifting his weight uncomfortably. "Judge will explain everything." With a weary sigh, William saddled his old mule. The steady clip-clop of hooves marked their descent from his mountain sanctuary into the bustling town below. Morning dew still clung to the sage, and meadowlarks called across the valley as they rode. The courthouse stood stern and official, its weather-beaten clapboards a reminder of civilization's grip. Inside, Judge Harrison's gavel crashed against wood, silencing the whispers that had followed William's entrance. "William Hale," the judge intoned, peering over his spectacles, "you are hereby ordered to marry Miss Zoe Bellamy, daughter of Thomas Bellamy, to preserve her honor and standing in this community." William's throat went dry. "Your Honor, I don't—" "The lady has remained unmarried far too long," the judge continued, his voice sharp. "Tongues are wagging. Her father demands this situation be remedied immediately." From the gathered crowd came cruel whispers about Zoe's size, words that made William's stomach turn despite his own reluctance. He'd seen the girl at church sometimes, always sitting quiet and proper, despite the sideways glances and snickers. "I'm a mountain man," William protested. "Live alone, got no business with a wife." Thomas Bellamy stepped forward, his expensive boots clicking on the wooden floor. "You'll do as ordered, Hale, or there'll be consequences. I've got friends in the land office who'd be mighty interested in reviewing your claim." The threat hung heavy in the air. William's hands clenched into fists, but he knew when he was cornered. "Yes, Your Honor," he ground out. That afternoon, the small church filled with townsfolk eager to witness the spectacle. William stood stiffly in his cleanest shirt, watching as Zoe walked down the aisle. She wore a simple blue dress, her head held high despite the red that colored her cheeks. Something in her quiet dignity touched him, even as he resented the trap he'd been forced into. Preacher Crane spoke the familiar words, his kind eyes moving between them. "Dearly beloved." William barely heard the ceremony, too aware of the weight of eyes upon them, the whispered comments, the barely concealed smirks. When it came time to speak the vows, Zoe's voice was soft but steady. His own words came out rough, like bark scraping stone. The wedding supper at the Bellamy Ranch House stretched into an endless parade of awkward moments. Thomas Bellamy held court at the head of the table, while William picked at food he couldn't taste. Zoe sat beside him, proper and contained, speaking only when spoken to. As the evening wore on and lanterns cast long shadows across the walls, William felt the crushing weight of this unwanted bond. He was a man used to silence and solitude, not social obligations, and a wife he'd never courted. The guests finally began to leave, their false congratulations hanging in the air like trail dust. In a quiet moment between goodbyes, Zoe turned to him. Her eyes held a mixture of resignation and determination that made his chest tight. "I'll not be a burden to you, sir," she whispered, her words meant for him alone. William looked at her then, really looked at her for the first time. Past the whispers and judgments of others, he saw something in her face, a strength that matched his own stubborn independence. He didn't know what to say, so he simply nodded, his throat too tight for words. The lanterns burned lower, casting shadows that seemed to mirror the uncertainty of their future. Tomorrow, he would take her up to his line shack, to a life neither of them had chosen. But for now, they stood in this moment of transition, two strangers bound by law and circumstance, trying to find their footing on unfamiliar ground. The wagon creaked and swayed as William guided the horses up the winding mountain trail. Autumn painted the aspens in gold, but dark clouds gathered above the peaks, promising early snow. The crisp mountain air carried the scent of pine and sage, mixing with the leather of the harness and the earthy smell of the horses' sweat. Beside him, Zoe sat straight-backed on the hard wooden seat, her small carpet bag clutched tightly in her lap. Her eyes remained fixed on her hands, folded neatly over the worn fabric. She hadn't spoken since they'd left town, and William found himself oddly grateful for the silence. The cabin appeared as they crested the final rise, a simple structure of rough-hewn logs nestled against the mountainside. Smoke wisped from the stone chimney where he'd banked the morning's fire before riding to town. It looked smaller now, more sparse, as he saw it through new eyes. William pulled the wagon to a stop. "This is home," he said, his voice gruff from disuse. Zoe nodded once, still not looking up. Inside, the cabin was just as he'd left it. One room with a stone fireplace, a narrow bed pushed against the far wall, and a rough-made table with two mismatched chairs. His few possessions hung from pegs or sat in neat rows on crude shelves. Everything had its place, arranged for the efficiency of a solitary life. "It ain't much," William admitted, watching Zoe take in the space. Her face remained carefully blank, betraying nothing of her thoughts. Supper that night was simple. Beans and cornbread he'd prepared that morning before the sheriff's arrival. They ate in silence, the clink of spoons against tin plates the only sound besides the crackling fire. William kept his eyes on his plate, uncertain what to do with this stranger who was now his wife. When dawn broke the next morning, William woke to unexpected sounds. He opened his eyes to find Zoe already up and moving about the cabin. She'd taken his old broom and was sweeping the hearth with sure, steady strokes. Her hair was neatly braided, her sleeves rolled up for work. Before he could speak, she was outside, filling the big iron pot with water from the creek. Steam soon rose from the pot as she built up the fire beneath it, sorting through his pile of dirty clothes with practical efficiency. William stood in the doorway, watching as she worked. Her movements were purposeful, unhurried. There was no complaint about the rough conditions, no hesitation in handling the heavy pot or dealing with his worn clothing. By midday, clean clothes hung on the line, snapping in the mountain breeze. Zoe had settled at the table with his old coat, the one with the torn sleeve he'd been meaning to fix. Her needle flashed in the sunlight, streaming through the window as she made neat, even stitches. William found himself pausing in his own chores to observe her. She was neither the helpless burden he'd feared, nor the idle woman of wealth he'd assumed. Her hands were sure and capable, her industry quiet but constant. As evening approached, new smells filled the cabin. Zoe had found his stores and turned them into something remarkable. The venison stew she'd prepared filled the air with savory aromas that made his mouth water. Onions and herbs he hadn't even remembered having transformed the simple meal into something that reminded him of home-cooked suppers long forgotten. "Much obliged," William said stiffly when she set the bowl before him. The words felt inadequate, but they were all he could manage. Inside, he felt an unsettling mixture of admiration and confusion. This woman, forced upon him by circumstance, was proving herself in ways he hadn't expected. The fire cast dancing shadows on the log walls as they finished their meal. Zoe looked up from her bowl, meeting his eyes across the flames for the first time since their arrival. "I mean to earn my place here," she said softly, her voice carrying quiet determination. William found he couldn't answer. The words stuck in his throat, tangled with emotions he wasn't ready to examine. Instead, he nodded, acknowledging her declaration with the respect it deserved. That night, as he lay on his bedroll near the fire, having insisted Zoe take the bed, sleep came easier than he'd expected. The cabin felt different somehow, changed by the presence of this unexpected woman with her capable hands and quiet strength. Her steady breathing from across the room merged with the familiar sounds of the mountain night, and William drifted off, his usual heavy thoughts lighter than they'd been in years. The morning sun cast long shadows across the creek as Zoe and William hauled water together. The metal buckets clanked against stones, and cold mountain water sloshed over their boots. William had insisted on helping after seeing her struggle with the heavy loads yesterday. Zoe paused, setting her bucket down on a flat rock. Her hands twisted in her apron as she gathered her courage. "Mr. Hale, William, there's something you need to know about our marriage." William stopped, turning to face her. The creek bubbled past, its voice somehow too cheerful for the gravity in Zoe's tone. "My father," she swallowed hard. "He didn't arrange this match for my honor like the judge said. He lost a gambling debt, a big one. This marriage was how he paid it off." The bucket handle creaked under William's tightening grip, his knuckles turning white. "What are you saying?" "The men he owes, they're dangerous sorts. And I heard them talking." Zoe's voice dropped lower. "They mean to claim your land as part of the settlement. They think marrying me to you gives them some kind of right to it." William's jaw clenched. Without a word, he strode to the barn, returning minutes later with his horses saddled. "We're riding to town." The journey down the mountain was tense and silent. Zoe held tight to her saddle horn as they picked their way down the steep trail. By mid-morning, they reached the Bellamy ranch house, where her father sat on the porch with his usual crowd of hangers-on. "Well, if it ain't my daughter and her mountain man," Bellamy drawled, not bothering to rise from his chair. His cronies chuckled, passing a bottle between them. William dismounted in one fluid motion. "You want to tell me about this gambling debt, Bellamy? The one you traded your daughter to cover?" "Don't know what you're talking about." Bellamy's smirk grew wider as his friends gathered closer. "Judge married you two proper and legal. What's done is done." "And my land? That part of your scheme too?" Bellamy spread his hands wide, feigning innocence. "Your land's your business, Hale. Unless you're looking to sell?" Another round of laughter from his companions made William's fists clench. Before William could respond, movement caught his eye. A Ute family was passing by on the road, a mother, father, and two children leading a heavily laden pony. To his surprise, Zoe immediately turned in her saddle. "Good morning to you," she called out clearly, inclining her head respectfully. The family paused, studying her. After a moment, they returned her greeting with dignified nods. The exchange was brief, but weighted with unexpected courtesy. Bellamy's face darkened at the interaction. "Since when does my daughter speak to savages?" "Since she learned better manners than you," William snapped. He remounted his horse, his expression stone. "This ain't over, Bellamy." The ride home was quieter still. both of them lost in thought as clouds gathered overhead. By the time they reached the cabin, the first snowflakes were starting to fall. William immediately grabbed his axe and stalked to the woodpile. The steady thunk of steel biting into wood echoed across the yard as he threw himself into the task, working out his fury with each swing. Inside the cabin, Zoe mixed flour and water, working the dough with steady, rhythmic motions. Her face remained calm, but determination sparked in her eyes as she kneaded. The familiar task seemed to ground her. William paused in the doorway, arms full of split logs. Snow dusted his shoulders as he watched her work. The cabin that had felt like a prison when they'd first arrived now seemed different, like a fortress they would defend together. The snow fell harder outside, but inside was warm and smelled of rising bread. William stacked the wood carefully by the hearth, each piece a silent promise. Whatever scheme Bellamy and his creditors had planned, they would find this mountain harder to conquer than they'd bargained for. Zoe shaped the dough into loaves with sure hands, her movements precise and focused. Without looking up, she said quietly, "We'll fight them." "Yes," William answered, surprised by how natural the "we" felt. "We will." The cabin settled around them as evening drew in, creaking slightly in the wind. What had begun as an unwanted marriage now carried larger stakes: their home, their land, their very freedom to choose their own path. As the snow continued falling, William realized they were bound together now by more than just a judge's order. They had become allies in a fight neither had seen coming, but neither would run from. A week passed like water through mountain stones. The morning brought a commotion from town that drew William and Zoe down from their cabin. 3 men in expensive Eastern suits stood before the sheriff's office, their polished boots unmarked by trail dust. Railroad agent Silas Morton, thin as a rail spike and twice as sharp, unrolled a map across the wooden boardwalk. "As you can see, Sheriff Riker, these documents clearly show the spring on Hale's property falls within the railroad's right-of-way." Morton's voice carried the practiced smoothness of well-oiled machinery. William dismounted, his spurs ringing against the wooden planks. Zoe stayed close beside him as they approached. "That spring's been on my land since before there was talk of any railroad," William said, his voice low but firm. Morton barely glanced up, his fingers tracing lines on the official-looking papers. "The survey maps and water rights documentation say otherwise, Mr. Hale. All properly filed and certified in Denver." Sheriff Riker shifted uncomfortably, thumbs hooked in his gun belt. "Seems they've got their papers in order, William." "Papers can lie," William growled. "That spring feeds my stock and waters my crops. Without it, the land's worth nothing." "Progress requires sacrifice," Morton replied smoothly. "The railroad's prepared to offer fair compensation, of course." He produced another document, numbers marching across it in neat columns. William's jaw clenched so tight, Zoe could see the muscle jumping. "The spring ain't for sale?" Morton's smile never wavered. "I'm afraid it's not a matter of sale, Mr. Hale. These are legal documents. The sheriff can confirm their authenticity." Riker studied his boots, unwilling to meet William's eyes. "Ain't much I can do, William. They've got the law on their side." The ride home stretched long and silent. William's back was rigid in the saddle, his shoulders set like stone. Only when they crossed the creek did he speak, his voice rough. "Without that spring, we can't work the land, can't water stock, can't grow enough to survive winter." Zoe watched him through supper, the stew going cold in his bowl as he stared into nothing. When the dishes were cleared and the lamp turned low, she settled in her chair by the fire. "We need to prepare," she said softly. "Store what we can for winter and—" She hesitated, then pressed on. "We need friends, William. Allies who know the truth of this land." William looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "The Ute camp near the North Meadow. They've used these waters longer than any of us. They might help us fight this." The next morning dawned clear and cold. Zoe wrapped fresh-baked bread in clean cloth while William watched with uncertainty. Together they rode to the Ute encampment, smoke rising from its lodges in thin columns against the mountain sky. William's hand stayed near his gun, old habits dying hard. But Zoe dismounted with quiet confidence, holding her bread before her like a peace offering. Women looked up from their work, children peeking out from behind blankets. Ute matriarch Asha emerged from her lodge, her silver hair gleaming in the sunlight. She studied Zoe with eyes that had seen many winters. Zoe stepped forward and bowed her head respectfully. "I bring bread, made by my hands," she said clearly. "I would learn your ways of cooking, if you would teach me." William watched, amazed, as Asha's weathered face softened. The matriarch accepted the bread, breaking it and sharing pieces among her people. Then she gestured for Zoe to join the women by their cooking fires. Through the afternoon, Zoe worked beside the Ute women, watching their methods, asking questions with genuine interest. William saw how they welcomed her, showing her their ways of preparing roots and berries. She treated them with the same dignity she showed everyone, and they responded in kind. As the sun settled toward the peaks, Asha approached William where he stood apart. "Your woman has a good heart," she said simply. "She sees people as people." William nodded, suddenly ashamed of his own long-held distance from these neighbors. "Yes, she does." They rode home in the gathering dusk, the air sharp with coming frost. Inside their cabin, William sat by the fire, drawing his knife against the whetstone in long, steady strokes. The steel sang a quiet song of preparation. Zoe moved about the cabin, humming an old hymn as she worked. The tune wrapped around them both like a warm blanket, making the space feel more like home than it ever had before. The railroad's threat still loomed large as the mountains themselves. But watching Zoe by lamplight, William felt something shift inside him. They were no longer two strangers forced together by a judge's order. They had become partners in a fight that would take all their combined strength to win. Winter settled over the mountains like a heavy blanket, turning William and Zoe's world white and silent. Their breath frosted in the morning air as they emerged from the cabin to begin each day's work. The routine of survival bound them together, hauling water from the creek, feeding the constant hunger of the iron stove, and the endless task of splitting wood to keep warm. William noticed how Zoe never complained, even when her fingers grew red and chapped from washing in icy water. She worked steadily, her movements growing more sure as the days passed. The awkwardness between them began to thaw like creek ice in spring sunshine. One bitter evening, William's axe slipped while splitting a stubborn oak log. Pain flashed across his palm, bright blood staining the snow. Before he could react, Zoe was there, leading him firmly inside by his uninjured hand. "Sit," she commanded, already gathering clean cloth and the bottle of witch hazel she kept for such emergencies. Her touch was gentle but sure as she cleaned the wound, her broad fingers surprisingly delicate as she wrapped the bandage. William watched her work, noting how the lamplight caught golden highlights in her brown hair. Her face held complete concentration, the same focus she brought to every task. When she finished tying off the bandage, their hands remained connected for a moment longer than necessary. "You're stronger than most men I've known," William said quietly, surprising himself with the words. A blush colored Zoe's cheeks, but her smile was pleased and genuine. She ducked her head, but not before William caught the sparkle in her eyes. 3 days later, as William prepared for a hunting trip, Zoe stood in the doorway, wearing her warmest coat. "I'm coming with you," she announced, her chin lifted in determination. William started to protest, but stopped at the look in her eyes. He handed her his spare rifle instead, showing her how to check the loading mechanism. To his surprise, she handled the weapon with natural care and respect. They tracked a snowshoe hare through the fresh powder, moving quietly through the winter woods. When the creature finally appeared, Zoe raised the rifle with steady hands. The shot cracked across the silent forest, clean and true. The hair dropped instantly. "Never shot anything before," Zoe admitted, as they retrieved their prize. "But Papa insisted I learn to handle a gun, even if he never let me hunt." Her voice held pride mixed with old hurt. William nodded, seeing new depths in this woman he'd been forced to marry. "You've got a good eye," he said simply. Back at the cabin, Zoe transformed their hunt into a feast. She worked with practiced efficiency, preparing the hare with herbs she'd dried in the autumn. Soon rich stew bubbled in the iron pot, filling their small home with savory warmth. The wind rose as evening fell, driving snow against the cabin walls. William sat in his chair by the fire, watching Zoe across the dancing flames. She worked on mending one of his shirts, her needle flashing in the firelight. He realized with sudden clarity that he no longer saw what the town saw, a girl they deemed unmarriageable because of her size. Instead, he saw a woman of quiet strength and grace, whose hands could be gentle or strong as needed, whose heart held more courage than most. Zoe must have felt his gaze. She glanced up, then lowered her eyes quickly, but not before William caught the soft smile on her lips. "I've prayed for this," she whispered, so quietly he almost missed it over the howling storm. "For what?" he asked, his voice equally soft. She kept her eyes on her sewing, but her cheeks flushed pink in the firelight. "For you to see me. Really see me." The wind rattled the cabin's shutters, but inside, the silence between them felt warm and full of possibility. William watched the firelight play across Zoe's face and realized that somehow, without his noticing, their forced marriage had begun to feel less like a burden and more like an unexpected blessing. A warm Chinook wind swept down from the mountains, softening the crusty snow into spring-scented puddles. Zoe stood at the cabin window, watching droplets fall from the eaves while she kneaded bread dough with strong, sure movements. "William," she called softly, "I've been thinking about the railroad trouble." He looked up from mending his boots by the fire. "What about it?" "We need to bring people together, settlers and Utes both. Show the railroad we stand as one." Her hands never stopped working the dough as she spoke. "I want to hold a church supper." William's weathered face creased with doubt. "Town folks won't come. And the Utes?" "They will if we ask proper," Zoe interrupted, her voice gentle but firm. "The Lord provides ways to bridge what seems impossible." Over the next 3 days, Zoe threw herself into preparations. The cabin filled with the sweet scent of baking as she produced loaf after golden loaf of bread. She rolled out pie crusts and filled them with dried apples and berries she'd preserved in autumn. The small table groaned under the weight of her efforts. William watched with growing admiration as Zoe insisted they visit every cabin and settlement within riding distance. She balanced carefully on their mule, holding her precious basket of bread as they made their way through melting snow. At each stop, she extended a personal invitation, her genuine warmth drawing reluctant smiles even from the most suspicious faces. The evening of the supper arrived clear and calm. William and Zoe arrived early to light the lamps in the church hall. She arranged the tables in a great circle, saying it would help people see each other as equals. Her own dishes joined the potluck offerings others brought: steaming stews, corn pone, and fresh-caught fish. The settlers trickled in first, stamping snow from their boots and clustering uncertainly near the doors. Then the Ute family appeared, led by matriarch Asha, their faces proud but guarded. A tense silence fell over the room. Zoe moved forward immediately, her smile radiant. "Welcome, welcome." She gestured to seats at the front of the hall, treating them with the same natural courtesy she showed everyone. "Please, sit here where it's warmest." William noticed how she spoke clearly, but not loudly, showing respect without condescension. Asha's stern expression softened slightly as she accepted the offered chair. Slowly, cautiously, the two groups began to mingle. Zoe moved among them like a spirit of harmony, making introductions and encouraging people to share dishes. "Try Sarah's venison stew," she urged the Ute children. "And oh, you must taste these honey cakes Asha has brought." The initial awkward silence gave way to murmurs of appreciation over the food. William watched in amazement as his wife orchestrated the gathering with gentle skill. She drew out shy settlers' wives and encouraged weather-beaten ranchers to explain their concerns about water rights. The Ute elders, seeing themselves treated with genuine respect, began sharing their own stories of the valley. As the evening wore on, conversation flowed more freely. Children from both communities played marbles in the corner, while their parents discovered common ground in their love of the land and their fears about the railroad's encroachment. "We must stand together," Asha declared, her quiet voice carrying authority. "The Iron Horse Company divides us to conquer all." Nods of agreement rippled through the gathering. Hands that had once held weapons against each other now passed plates of pie and shook in friendship. William saw the moment when the mood shifted from tolerance to true fellowship. As the last lanterns were being extinguished, William found Zoe gathering her empty dishes. The pride in his heart nearly overwhelmed him. He took her hand, rough fingers gentle against her soft palm. "Thank you," he said hoarsely. "You had the courage to do what I never could. To reach out, to trust." Zoe's smile in the dim light was shy but radiant. "The Lord makes bridges," she whispered. "We just have to be brave enough to cross them." Looking at their joined hands, his scarred and weathered, hers strong and capable, William realized that the most important bridge built that night might be the one between his own heart and the remarkable woman he had been forced to marry. The journey home from the church supper filled William and Zoe with newfound hope. Their mules' hooves crunched through patches of melting snow as stars winked overhead, seeming to mirror the light in their hearts. "Reckon that went better than anyone could have expected," William said, his normally gruff voice softened with pride. Zoe hummed in agreement, her hands folded in her lap. "The Lord works in mysterious ways. Sometimes it just takes one small step to start something bigger." The following days brought a peace William hadn't known in years. The weather held fair, perfect for tackling repairs he'd long postponed. The barn roof had leaked all winter, so he and Zoe set about replacing the worn shingles together. William found himself surprised by how natural it felt working alongside her. Zoe proved steady on the ladder, passing up tools and shingles without complaint. Her quiet determination matched his own, and more than once, her clever suggestions made the work easier. "Hand me that hammer," he called down one afternoon. "Which one?" Zoe teased. "The one you dropped twice already?" William felt his lips twitch into a smile. "Now who's keeping count?" Their shared laughter drifted across the yard, as welcome as the spring breeze. Each day, the awkwardness between them eased a little more, replaced by something warmer. One evening, after a simple supper of beans and cornbread, Zoe disappeared into their sleeping loft. She returned carrying something wrapped in brown paper. "I've been working on this," she said softly, presenting the package to William. "For you?" William unwrapped it carefully, revealing a quilt pieced together from scraps of fabric. The pattern showed a series of interlocking squares, each one slightly different, but forming a unified whole. The stitching was neat and strong, clearly done with great care. "It's called Endurance," Zoe explained, her cheeks pink. "The pattern, seemed fitting somehow." William ran his calloused fingers over the careful stitches, too moved to speak. No one had made him something so personal since his mother passed. The quilt represented hours of patient work, each piece chosen and placed with thought for him. The peaceful spell shattered the following Sunday. They had ridden into town for services, William wearing his best shirt, and Zoe with a ribbon in her hair. The morning passed pleasantly enough, though William noticed railroad agent Morton watching them with cold eyes from the back pew. As the congregation filed out into the bright afternoon, someone shouted, "Fire on the ridge!" William's heart stopped. Black smoke rose from the direction of their cabin. He and Zoe mounted their mule immediately, pushing the animal harder than ever before. Other townspeople followed on horseback, but William barely noticed them. They arrived to find their home engulfed in flames. The heat drove them back as timber crashed and sparks flew. Everything they owned burned before their eyes: their food stores, tools, winter clothing, and all of Zoe's careful touches that had made the cabin a home. William's legs gave out, and he dropped to his knees in the melting snow. His fists clenched until his knuckles went white, rage and despair warring in his chest. Behind him, he heard Zoe's soft cry as she found the remains of the quilt she'd made him, now nothing but charred scraps. The gathered townsfolk shifted uneasily, their whispers carrying on the smoke-laden air. "Has to be them railroad men," muttered old Jake Cooper, "trying to drive folks off their land." "Could be Bellamy's doing," countered Widow Sarah. "Everyone knows he's in deep with them creditors." As darkness fell, the last flames died to embers. The cabin was nothing but a blackened skeleton against the purple mountains. Friends offered shelter, but William couldn't bear their pitying looks. He and Zoe retreated to the church, where Reverend Davies gave them permission to sleep in the loft. They lay quiet in their borrowed blankets, the smell of smoke still clinging to their clothes. The future they'd begun to build together lay in ashes, as uncertain as the shadows around them. William stared into the darkness, hearing Zoe's uneven breathing and knowing she fought tears. Through the window, he could see the stars that had seemed so bright with promise just days before. Now they felt cold and distant, offering no answers to the questions that burned in his heart. Who had done this? How would they rebuild? And most importantly, how could he protect the woman who had somehow become so precious to him? The morning after the fire dawned cold and gray. William mounted his mule, jaw set with determination as he rode toward town. Zoe watched him go, wringing her hands in worry. The street dust swirled around William's boots as he dismounted in front of the sheriff's office, ready to demand justice. Instead of finding help, he found trouble waiting. "William Hale," Sheriff Riker announced, rising from behind his desk with a document in hand. "You're under arrest for trespassing on railroad property." William's face darkened. "What foolishness is this? That's my land, bought and paid for." "Not according to these papers." Railroad Agent Morton stepped from the shadows, a cold smile playing on his lips. "The railroad's claim predates yours. You've been squatting illegally." William's hand instinctively moved toward his belt, but the sheriff was faster. In moments, William found himself disarmed and locked behind iron bars, his protests echoing off the jail's bare walls. Zoe arrived shortly after, having followed William into town. She rushed to the sheriff's desk, her voice trembling but determined. "Please, Sheriff Riker, you know this isn't right. William's done nothing wrong." "Step back, Mrs. Hale," Morton commanded. When Zoe didn't move, he roughly shoved her towards the door. She stumbled but caught herself, tears burning in her eyes. "This isn't over," she promised, looking at William through the bars before being forced outside. The ride back to their destroyed homestead felt endless. Zoe's heart ached with each step of her mule's hooves. When she finally reached the smoking ruins, her legs gave way. She knelt in the ashes of what had briefly been her home, her fingers sifting through the gray powder that had once been their life together. As darkness fell, Zoe remained among the ruins. Her voice broke the evening silence as she prayed aloud, "Lord, give me strength. Show me the way to help William and save our home." The first light of dawn found her already at work. She moved methodically through the destruction, salvaging whatever might be useful. Her hands, though soft from her privileged upbringing, grew rough as she sorted through the debris. She found scraps of iron that could be reused, pieces of charred wood that might still serve a purpose. Her heart leaped when she discovered their family Bible, its edges burnt but its core intact. She pressed it to her chest, drawing comfort from its familiar weight. Each day, Zoe made the journey into town, carrying food for William. She packed the best of their dwindling supplies, fresh bread she baked in kind neighbors' ovens, dried meat, and clean water. The townsfolk's whispers followed her down the street. "Look at her, still playing devoted wife. Guess even a rich man's daughter can fall mighty low." Cruel laughter rang out behind her, but Zoe held her head high. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. At the jail, she passed William's meals through the bars, their fingers touching briefly with each exchange. She told him about her salvage efforts, about the Bible she'd found, about the people who'd shown kindness despite the general hostility. One evening, as shadows lengthened across the jail floor, Zoe pressed close to the bars. "I will not abandon you," she whispered, her voice fierce with conviction. William's rough hands reached through the iron bars to grip hers. The proud mountain man's eyes shone with unshed tears. "I never thought," he started, then swallowed hard. "I never thought anyone would stand by me like this." While making her daily rounds in town, Zoe's ears caught fragments of disturbing conversations. In the general store, she overheard two men discussing railroad money changing hands at the county office. Outside the saloon, ranch hands whispered about bribes being paid to officials who controlled land titles. The pieces fell into place like a grim puzzle. The railroad wasn't just stealing their land, they were corrupting the very systems meant to protect honest folks. Each night, as Zoe bedded down in the church loft alone, she turned these facts over in her mind. She knew with growing certainty that she would have to act. The path ahead looked dangerous. She'd be challenging powerful men who had already proven their willingness to destroy homes and lives. But as she clutched their saved Bible, she felt steel entering her spine. William had protected her when she needed it most. Now it was her turn to fight for him, no matter the cost. Snow dusted Zoe's shoulders as she slipped through the back door of her father's ranch house. She knew his habits well. He would be at the saloon until sundown. The familiar smell of leather and pipe tobacco filled the study as she eased open the heavy oak door. Her hands trembled as she lit the desk lamp. The yellow light revealed stacks of papers and leather-bound ledgers scattered across the massive desk. Taking a deep breath, Zoe began her search. The first drawer yielded nothing but old correspondence. The second contained hunting permits and cattle sales records. But in the third drawer, beneath a false bottom she remembered from childhood, Zoe found what she sought. Her fingers flew through the pages of a worn ledger, heart pounding. Numbers swam before her eyes until entries began jumping out. Debt owed to Morton, $5,000. Payment due, railroad land rights. W. Hale property, collateral transfer. Zoe's hands shook as she read. Here was the proof. Her father had gambled away not just her future, but William's land too. The entries showed a trail of mounting debts and desperate deals with railroad agent Morton. A floorboard creaked behind her. "What do you think you're doing, girl?" Her father's voice, thick with whiskey, made her spine stiffen. She hadn't heard him return. "Finding the truth," Zoe said, clutching the ledger to her chest as she turned. His face darkened. "Give me those papers." "No." Zoe backed toward the door. "These belong to the judge now." "You ungrateful!" He lunged for her, but years of drink had slowed his reflexes. Zoe ducked past him and ran, her skirts whipped around her legs as she fled through the house. Behind her, she heard crashes and curses as her father gave chase. The barn door stood open. Zoe raced inside, her breath coming in white puffs in the cold air. Working quickly, she saddled her mare while her father's shouts grew closer. Snow was falling heavily as Zoe urged her horse into a gallop. The ledger and papers were secured inside her coat. Through the swirling white, she could barely make out the trail, but her mare knew the way to the cabin ruins. The wind howled around them as they climbed higher into the mountains. Zoe's fingers grew numb on the reins, but she pressed on. Behind her, she heard hoofbeats fade as her father gave up the chase in the worsening weather. At the burned cabin, Zoe dismounted stiffly. She hurried to where she'd hidden her sewing basket in a hollow tree, safe from the elements. Carefully, she tucked the damning papers between layers of fabric and replaced the basket. Her mare stamped restlessly as fresh snow gathered on her back. Zoe knew she couldn't delay. The Ute camp was an hour's ride away, and darkness was falling. The snow eased as she approached the circle of lodgepole pine teepees. Dogs announced her arrival, and women emerged to see who approached in the growing dusk. Matriarch Asha stood waiting, her lined face grave. "You come late, daughter. Something troubles you." "I need your help," Zoe said, dismounting. Her legs shook from the cold ride. "I have proof of the railroad's crimes." Inside Asha's teepee, warmth from the central fire slowly returned feeling to Zoe's frozen fingers. She spread the papers before the matriarch, explaining each document's significance. Other elders gathered to listen as she revealed how her father and the railroad men had conspired to steal both settler and tribal lands. Asha studied the papers in silence. Finally, she looked up. "These men break both white man's law and natural law. They poison the land with their greed." "Will you stand with me?" Zoe asked. "When I take these to the county judge?" The old woman's dark eyes held Zoe's. "You show courage, standing against your own blood. We will witness for you." Relief flooded through Zoe. She hadn't realized until that moment how afraid she'd been of facing this battle alone. That night, sleep eluded her, despite the comfort of warm furs and the teepee's shelter. She lay awake, listening to the wind and praying for strength. Tomorrow's ride to the county seat would test everything she had in her. As the first gray light of dawn crept over the mountains, Zoe rose. Her muscles protested after the previous day's hard ride, but there was no time for weakness. She secured the precious papers inside her cloak, checking twice to ensure they were protected from the weather. Asha pressed a small medicine pouch into her hands. "For courage," the old woman said. "Remember, you do not ride alone." Zoe's throat tightened with gratitude. She mounted her mare, drawing her cloak close against the bitter morning wind. The snow had stopped, leaving the world clean and white beneath a pearl-gray sky. With a final nod to the Ute elders, Zoe turned her horse toward the county seat. The papers that could save William and their land rode safely against her heart. She had found her courage at last. The county seat bustled with activity as Zoe guided her weary horse down the main street. Steam locomotives whistled in the distance, their black smoke hanging low in the winter sky. After 2 grueling days crossing icy mountain passes, her body ached, and exhaustion clouded her mind. The courthouse rose before her, an imposing brick building with white columns. Zoe dismounted stiffly, her legs trembling from the long ride. She clutched her precious bundle of papers closer beneath her worn shawl. A few passers-by stared at her travel-stained clothes and mud-spattered skirts, but she held her head high. Inside, the courthouse hallway echoed with boot steps on polished wood. Zoe approached the clerk's desk, her heart pounding. "I must see Judge Harrison," she said, forcing steadiness into her voice. "It concerns illegal railroad claims and fraud." The clerk peered at her over wire-rimmed spectacles. "The judge is hearing cases now. You'll have to wait." "Please," Zoe pressed. "Lives and livelihoods depend on this evidence." Something in her tone made the clerk pause. He studied her face, then nodded slowly. "Wait here." Minutes crawled by as Zoe stood in the hallway. Her fingers worried the edges of the papers hidden in her shawl. Finally, the clerk returned. "The judge will see you now." Judge Harrison sat behind a massive desk, his gray eyes sharp beneath bushy brows. He frowned as Zoe approached. "Young woman, I'm told you have urgent business with this court?" Zoe's hands trembled as she laid the documents before him. "Your Honor, I have evidence of fraud and illegal dealings between the railroad company and my father, James Bellamy." The judge's frown deepened as he examined the papers. "These are serious allegations." "There is more, Your Honor." Zoe's voice grew stronger. "I was forced into marriage with William Hale to cover my father's gambling debts. The railroad then used false claims to seize Mr. Hale's land and have him imprisoned." A murmur rose from the growing crowd of townsfolk gathering in the doorway. Judge Harrison held up a hand for silence. "You realize the gravity of what you're saying? You accuse your own father of corruption?" "I do." Zoe stood straighter. "The ledger shows everything. The debts, the bribes, the illegal transfer of land rights. Railroad agent Morton conspired with my father to steal not just settler lands, but Ute territory as well." The judge studied the ledger entries, his expression grave. More townspeople pressed into the room, drawn by the drama unfolding. Zoe felt their stares but kept her eyes on the judge. "The Ute people will testify to these claims," she added. "They have witnessed the railroad's methods firsthand." Judge Harrison was silent for a long moment, studying the papers before him. Finally, he looked up. "These documents appear genuine. The evidence of corruption is concerning." He straightened in his chair. "I hereby order an immediate investigation into these allegations. Deputy." A young deputy stepped forward from the crowd. "Ride to Pine Creek. Release William Hale into this woman's custody pending a full hearing." Relief made Zoe's knees weak, but she remained standing. The judge fixed her with a stern look. "Be warned, this fight is far from over. The railroad has powerful friends, but you've shown remarkable courage in bringing this forward." "Thank you, Your Honor," Zoe whispered. 2 days later, Zoe waited outside the Pine Creek jail, pulling her shawl tight against the bitter wind. The door creaked open, and William emerged, blinking in the bright winter sunlight. He stopped short when he saw her. His beard had grown ragged in the jail cell, and his shoulders stooped with weariness. But as their eyes met, something broke in his weathered face. Tears spilled into his beard as he stumbled toward her. "Zoe," he choked out. "My brave, beautiful Zoe." She caught him as he fell to his knees, holding him close as his shoulders shook with silent sobs. Her own tears fell into his tangled hair. "You saved me," he whispered hoarsely. "I never dreamed anyone would fight so hard for me. How could I not?" Zoe helped him to his feet, her heart full. "You're my husband." William's calloused hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch infinitely gentle. In his eyes, she saw wonder and gratitude, and something deeper that made her breath catch. The deputy who had brought William watched from the jail doorway. "Remember, there's still a hearing to face, but you've got a strong case thanks to your wife." William's arm tightened around Zoe's shoulders. "Then we'll face it together." The winter sun hung low as William and Zoe made their way along the snowy mountain trail. Their horses moved carefully through the deep drifts, breath steaming in the cold air. William kept his mount close to Zoe's, watching her with a mix of wonder and humility. At midday, they stopped to rest the horses near a sheltered grove of pines. As Zoe unpacked their meager supplies, William gathered dry branches for a small fire. The flames cast dancing shadows across the snow as they shared a humble meal of dried beef and hard biscuits. "I've been thinking," William said softly, breaking their comfortable silence. His weathered face was thoughtful in the firelight. "All this time I thought I was meant to be your protector. Turns out you were mine." Zoe looked up from warming her hands by the fire. A gentle smile touched her lips. "We protect each other," she replied, her voice steady and sure. "That's what marriage truly means, doesn't it?" William ducked his head, overcome by the simple truth of her words. The fire crackled between them as he struggled to find his voice. I reckon you're right about that. They continued their journey as afternoon shadows lengthened across the snow. William found his gaze drawn to Zoe again and again, the straight set of her shoulders, the quiet dignity in her bearing. She was no longer the frightened bride who had arrived at his cabin months ago, or perhaps she had always been this strong, and he had been too blind to see it. The sun was setting when they finally crested the last rise before their homestead. William's chest tightened at the sight that greeted them. Where their burned cabin had stood, a crowd of people gathered. Settlers and Utes alike moved purposefully around the ruins, carrying timber and tools. What in heaven's name? William breathed. Zoe's eyes filled with tears as they drew closer. Neighbors they had not seen in months were there. The Petersons from the Valley Farm, the Wilsons from across the creek. Even some of the railroad workers who had quit their jobs after hearing of the corruption had come to help. Preacher Elijah Crane stepped forward to greet them, his arms full of hymnals. "Welcome home," he said warmly. "Word of your courage spread quickly, Zoe. These good folks want to help rebuild what was lost." All around them, people worked together with shared purpose. The Ute women had set up cooking fires, the smell of stew mingling with wood smoke. Men worked side by side, clearing burnt timber and laying new foundation stones. Children ran back and forth carrying smaller supplies, their laughter bright in the winter air. "We brought what we could spare," Martha Peterson said, gesturing to piles of blankets, tools, and provisions. "It ain't much, but it's a start." William stood speechless, his throat tight with emotion. He had lived so long in isolation, convinced he needed no one. Now the sight of his neighbors, people he had kept at arm's length for years, working together to help him and Zoe brought him to the edge of tears. As night fell, lanterns and fires lit the work site. The first new cabin wall rose steadily, built stronger and larger than the original. Ute craftsmen showed the settlers their methods for notching logs, while settler women shared their quilting patterns with the Ute women. The sound of hammering mixed with hymns as Preacher Crane led those who wished in song. William found himself working alongside men he had barely spoken to before, discovering the simple pleasure of shared labor. But his eyes kept finding Zoe in the firelight. She moved through the crowd with quiet confidence, organizing work groups, ensuring everyone had hot coffee and food, solving small problems before they grew large. The same people who had once mocked her size now listened respectfully to her directions. Near midnight, William paused in his work, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cold. The wall they had raised cast long shadows in the firelight. All around him, people continued working, talking and laughing together. The Ute matriarch Asha sat with settler women, teaching them to weave sleeping mats from pine boughs. Children of both communities played together in the snow, heedless of any differences between them. For the first time in more years than he could count, William felt the warm embrace of belonging. This was more than neighbors helping neighbors. This was family. Not by blood, but by choice. And at the heart of it all was Zoe, her face glowing with inner light as she served hot coffee to tired workers. She caught his eye across the firelight and smiled, that same gentle smile that had begun to melt his frozen heart months ago. William smiled back, marveling at how this woman he had been forced to marry had led him back to life, back to community, back to love. The new cabin rose day by day, each log and beam stronger than those that had come before. Where William's old home had been rough-hewn and solitary, this one grew from the shared labor of many hands. The main room stretched wider, with proper windows to catch the mountain light. A dedicated kitchen space took shape, designed with Zoe's needs in mind. William and Zoe worked side by side from sunup to sundown, the sound of their laughter mixed with the steady rhythm of hammers and saws. Where once they had moved awkwardly around each other, now they fell into an easy partnership. William would lift a heavy beam, and Zoe would be there to guide it into place. She would sort nails, and he would have the hammer ready. During the midday breaks, while others rested in the shade, Zoe would bring out the half-burned Bible she had salvaged from the ashes. Settling on a fresh-cut log, she would open its charred pages with gentle hands. Her voice carried clear and strong as she read passages of hope and redemption. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord," she read one afternoon, her finger tracing the words. "Plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." William, who had long ago turned his back on matters of faith, found himself drawn to these quiet moments. At first, he merely listened, head bowed. But as days passed, he began to join Zoe in prayer. Something long frozen in his heart began to thaw as they knelt together in the evening, giving thanks for their blessings. "Been a long time since I trusted in anything bigger than myself," he admitted one night as they sat by their cooking fire. "Reckon I forgot how." Zoe reached for his calloused hand. "Faith is like building this cabin," she said softly. "Sometimes you need help remembering how it's done." When the last shingle was nailed in place and the chimney stood complete, the entire community gathered for a proper house blessing. Zoe spent 2 days preparing, refusing all offers of help in the kitchen. She worked from dawn to dusk, filling the new cabin with the smell of fresh-baked pies, hearty stew, and loaves of bread that made mouths water. The evening of the blessing arrived clear and crisp, with stars beginning to peek through the darkening sky. Lanterns were lit, casting a warm glow over the gathered faces. Settlers and Utes, railroad workers and townspeople, all together under one roof. Preacher Crane stood by the new hearth, Bible in hand, while children darted between adults' legs, sneaking treats from the laden tables. William watched Zoe move through the crowd, making sure everyone had plenty to eat. She had sewn a new dress for the occasion, and her cheeks were flushed with joy and pride. The same townsfolk who had once whispered cruel words now praised her cooking and asked for recipes. As the meal drew to a close, William felt something stirring in his chest that demanded to be spoken. He rose from his seat, clearing his throat roughly. The room gradually fell silent, all eyes turning to him. "Ain't much for speeches," he began, his voice gruff with emotion. "But I got something needs saying." He looked around at the faces of neighbors who had become friends, of strangers who had become family. "Thank you all for the help, the friendship, the second chance you gave 2 lonely souls." Then he turned to Zoe, who stood near the kitchen door, her eyes wide with surprise. "But mostly I need to thank you, Zoe." His voice grew stronger, filling the room. "When that judge forced us to marry, I thought it was a burden. I was wrong. You've shown me what true strength looks like, what faith looks like, what love looks like." He drew a deep breath. "And I want everyone here to know, I'm proud to be your husband, prouder than I've ever been of anything in my life." Tears spilled down Zoe's cheeks as the room erupted in applause and cheers. She moved toward William, and he gathered her in his arms, no longer caring who saw. The sound of their neighbor's joy washed over them like a blessing, stronger than any prayer. Through her tears, Zoe smiled up at him. "And I'm proud to be your wife," she whispered, her words for him alone. Around them, the celebration continued, voices raised in happiness and song. The new cabin seemed to glow from within, filled with warmth and light, and the promise of tomorrow. The crisp morning air carried sounds of the telegraph office's bell across the town square. Inside, the operator's fingers flew across the brass key, transcribing an incoming message that would change everything. Within hours, word spread through the valley like wildfire. The railroad had withdrawn all claims to the disputed lands. William and Zoe received the news while stacking firewood behind their new cabin. Sheriff Tucker rode up, waving a yellow telegram slip. "Court ruled in your favor," he called out, dismounting. Railroads pulling stakes, all of them. Judge says your testimony did it, Mrs. Hale. Zoe pressed her hands to her chest, tears welling in her eyes. William wrapped an arm around her shoulders, his weathered face breaking into a rare, full smile. That evening, more news arrived via a breathless neighbor boy. The rancher, Zoe's father, had fled town under cover of darkness, taking only what would fit in his saddlebags. His gambling debts and railroad dealings had finally caught up with him, leaving nothing but empty buildings and bitter memories behind. "Are you all right?" William asked Zoe softly as they sat at their new table, sharing a simple supper of fresh bread and stew. She nodded, stirring her bowl thoughtfully. "I made my peace with losing him long ago. He stopped being my father the day he traded me like cattle." Peace settled over the valley like fresh snow in the days that followed. Without the shadow of the railroad or the rancher's schemes hanging over them, William and Zoe turned their attention to making their house truly a home. Zoe hung her salvaged quilt on the main room's wall, its singed edges a reminder of all they had overcome. Though damaged by the fire, the pattern still told its story of endurance. She would often pause before it while doing her daily tasks, touching the fabric gently, grateful for this piece of their history that had survived. Together, they planted a small winter garden in the sheltered space behind the cabin. Though snow still draped the mountainsides, they prepared the soil with hope, marking out rows for hardy vegetables and herbs that could withstand the altitude. "My mother always said a home needs growing things," Zoe explained as she pressed seeds into the dark earth. William watched her practiced movements, marveling at how she brought life to everything she touched. One clear afternoon, William spent hours carefully carving their initials into the new mantle. His knife moved slowly, deliberately, each cut deep and permanent. WH plus ZH, surrounded by a simple heart. When Zoe saw it, she traced the letters with trembling fingers. That evening, as flames danced in the hearth beneath their carved initials, William sat beside Zoe on their bench. The firelight caught the silver threading through his dark hair and softened the lines around his eyes. He took her hands in his, calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "Been thinking," he said, voice rough with emotion, "about how this all started, how that judge forced us together." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But now I know something true. If I had 1,000 chances to choose again, I'd choose you every single time." Zoe's cheeks flushed pink in the firelight. Her eyes shone with unshed tears as she squeezed his hands. "The Lord chose first," she whispered. "He knew what we needed before we did." William leaned forward slowly, one hand rising to cup her cheek. For a moment they stayed that way, sharing the same breath. Then, with infinite tenderness, he pressed his lips to hers in their first real kiss. It was gentle, sweet with promise, sealing their bond not with duty or law, but with love freely given. When they finally parted, the fire crackled softly, sending sparks up the chimney like stars. Through the window, moonlight painted silver paths across their new floor, and peace wrapped around them like a warm blanket. At last, truly home. Spring burst into the valley like God's own paintbrush, sweeping away winter's gray with strokes of emerald and gold. Tender grass sprouted in the meadows, and wildflowers dotted the hillsides with splashes of purple and yellow. The creek ran full and clear with snowmelt, its song a constant companion to the new life emerging everywhere. William and Zoe walked through their fields, hand in hand, their footsteps in perfect rhythm. Where months ago there had been only frozen ground, now neat rows of vegetables pushed through rich soil. They paused often, Zoe pointing out new growth, while William squeezed her hand, both marveling at how their land had transformed alongside their hearts. The smell of fresh bread drew children from neighboring homesteads like honeybees to clover. They gathered around Zoe's kitchen window, their faces bright with hope and hunger. She'd laugh, cutting thick slices still warm from the oven, telling them tales of her own childhood while they munched contentedly. William would watch from his workshop, his heart full at the sound of their mingled laughter. The Ute family became regular visitors, bringing news from their travels and goods to trade. Where once there had been suspicion, now there was trust. They shared meals together, swapping stories and skills, their children playing together in the yard while the adults talked of weather and crops and hunting. One pristine Sunday morning, William and Zoe sat side by side in the church pews, their shoulders touching. Preacher Crane's words filled the small building with hope. Just as spring renews the land, so does the Lord renew our spirits. William felt Zoe's hand slip into his, and he held it tight, remembering how far they'd come. That evening, they sat together on their porch, watching the sun paint the western sky in shades of pink and gold. Their cabin glowed behind them, lamplight spilling through windows and smoke rising in lazy curls from the chimney. The air was sweet with spring blossoms and the promise of tomorrow. William drew Zoe close, his arm settling naturally around her shoulders. "This is home," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Zoe leaned into him, tears of joy gathering in her eyes. She didn't need to speak. They both knew the truth of it. In this forced union, they'd found something precious and rare, a love that had grown wild and strong, like spring flowers after winter's long night. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.